You know, they say some old houses have memories soaked into their very walls, almost like they breathe with the past. But Blackwood Creek, that place, the cabin my great-uncle Silas left me, wasn't just holding memories. It felt like it was, guarding something far more sinister, something ancient and deeply unsettling, something I was about to come face to face with in the most terrifying way imaginable. I'd inherited it months ago, this dilapidated structure hidden deep in a forest few people ever ventured into. My great-uncle Silas was always an eccentric, a recluse even by our family's quirky standards. Going out there, sorting through his life's remnants, felt like an obligation, a final dusty farewell. Part of me, a naive, city-softened part, even imagined a kind of rustic solitude, a break from the noise. I couldn't have been more wrong. That trip wasn't a retreat, it was a descent. The journey itself should have been my first warning. Miles of paved highway dwindled into cracked asphalt, then gravel roads that rattled the bones, and finally a barely there dirt track that seemed determined to swallow my car whole. The forest pressed in on either side, ancient trees forming a dense canopy that choked out the sunlight even in the middle of the day. It felt like driving into a tunnel, a long, dark passage to somewhere forgotten by time. By the time I finally lurched to a stop in what was generously called a clearing, a wave of profound isolation washed over me. The cabin was worse than I'd pictured from the grainy old photographs. It sagged, leaning precariously, almost swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. The silence was the most unnerving part, not a peaceful quiet, but a heavy, watchful stillness, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. The air inside was thick, not just with decades of dust and neglect, but with a kind of old, patient dread. As I forced open the creaking door, a puff of musty air escaped, like a sigh from the house itself, while sifting through a rotten wooden chest. In the main room, I found them, a collection of crudely carved wooden figures, about a dozen of them, small and strangely proportioned. Their faces were little more than gouges and lines, but their expressions were undeniably disturbing, almost leering. I shivered, tucking them back into the darkness of the chest, trying to dismiss the unease coiling in my stomach. But I couldn't shake the feeling that my arrival at Blackwood Creek, this intrusion into its forgotten world, hadn't gone unnoticed. The next day, grim reality set in. The few supplies I'd brought wouldn't last, and the cabin's pantry was bare save for cobwebs and mouse droppings. Necessity, then, drove me towards the nearest dot on the map, a hamlet called Oakhaven, some 10 rugged miles away. Oakhaven was less a town and more a collection of weathered buildings huddled together as if for protection against the vast, dark forest that surrounded it. The few locals I encountered at the general store, a place that smelled of damp wool and suspicion, were wary, their eyes lingering on me, an outsider with an unnerving lack of welcome. When I mentioned I was staying up at the old Silas Blackwood place, a hush fell over the small group by the counter. An old-timer, his face a road map of wrinkles, finally broke the silence. He leaned in, his voice a low rasp. "You be careful up there, young'un," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Things in Blackwood Forest, they belong to the woods, best not to disturb what sleeps." He then muttered something about folks who'd gone too deep, who'd either never come back or had returned, different. He waved a dismissive hand, as if trying to brush off his own words, calling them old wives' tales, but the conviction in his eyes was chilling. I tried to laugh it off as I paid for my meager groceries, chalking it up to small-town folklore, the kind designed to spook city folk like me. But the way he looked at me, a mixture of pity and something akin to fear, that look burrowed deep. And the laughter died in my throat, as the first heavy, bruised clouds of the promised storm began to gather on my drive back to the isolated cabin. The old man's words echoed in my mind, a discordant note against the rising wind. Back at the cabin, the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing minute. The weather, as if taking its cue from the old man's ominous warnings, shifted with a terrifying violence. The wind began to howl through the trees, not just a mournful sigh, but a tormented shriek that seemed to claw at the very foundations of the old structure. Rain, thick and furious, lashed against the grimy window panes, blurring the outside world into a maelstrom of green and grey. The sky, a churning canvas of black and purple, exploded with sudden violent cracks of thunder that vibrated through my chest, each one followed by searing flashes of lightning that momentarily illuminated the claustrophobic interior in stark, ghostly detail. Then, with a series of sputtering flickers, the power, as I dreaded, died. The cabin was plunged into an oppressive, suffocating darkness, the kind that feels alive. My flashlight beam cut a weak, trembling swathe through the gloom, but it was barely a comfort. My phone, of course, displayed no service. I was utterly, completely alone, cut off from the world. It was then, amidst the symphony of the storm's rage, that a new sound emerged, distinct and horrifyingly out of place. A slow, deliberate scraping against the cabin's outer wall. It wasn't the rhythmic thrash of a branch caught in the wind. This was methodical, dragging, as if something heavy was being pulled along the wood, circling the cabin. It paused, then started again, closer this time. Every crash of thunder made my heart leap into my throat, but it was that scraping, chillingly intentional, that told me with sickening certainty that the storm wasn't the only thing I had to fear that night. Something else was out there, in the raging dark, and it knew I was inside. My breath hitched, caught somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Gathering a sliver of courage I didn't know I possessed, or perhaps propelled by a terror so profound it bypassed rational thought, I crept towards one of the filthy windows overlooking the small, sodden clearing. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the flashlight steady. I waited, heart pounding like a drum against my ribs, for the next flash of lightning. When it came, splitting the sky with a blinding white glare, I peered out. For a fraction of a second, the scene was illuminated. The thrashing trees, the driving rain, and there, at the very edge of the tree line, partially obscured by the deluge and the swaying branches, a silhouette. Tall, unnaturally gaunt, just standing there, motionless, watching the cabin. Then darkness slammed back down, more absolute than before. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed its way up my throat. I stumbled back from the window, a choked cry escaping my lips. My first instinct was to secure myself. I rushed to the flimsy main door, my fingers fumbling with the rusty bolt, and then, in a frenzy, I dragged a heavy, dilapidated armchair across the floorboards, wedging it against the door. I checked the windows, ensuring their flimsy latches were fastened, knowing deep down they offered little real protection. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. An animal, a trick of the light and shadows. But the image was seared into my retinas, too distinct, too human-like, yet disturbingly not. As I spun around, flashlight beam dancing erratically, it landed on the dusty mantelpiece above the cold fireplace. My blood turned to ice. One of the crude wooden figures, the ones I'd found in the chest and sworn I'd left there, was now sitting on the mantel. It was propped up, facing the door I had just barricaded, its grotesque carved smile seeming to mock my efforts. I knew with a certainty that defied logic but chilled me to the bone that I hadn't moved it. It wasn't just outside anymore. The strangeness, the malevolence was seeping in. Was I losing my mind, succumbing to the isolation and the storm's fury? Or was this some kind of sick, terrifying game? The answer, I feared, was far more horrifying than either. Just as that thought solidified, a sudden, shockingly forceful banging erupted at the main door. It wasn't a tentative knock, not someone seeking shelter from the storm. This was a brutal, demanding assault, each blow shaking the entire rickety structure, rattling the windows in their frames. The sound was deafening, seeming to echo the violent crashes of thunder outside, as if the storm itself had decided to break its way in. There was no voice, no call for help, just that relentless, brutal pounding that spoke of raw, unrestrained aggression. My heart hammered against my ribs, so hard I thought it might burst. I scrambled backwards, deeper into the shadowed recesses of the cabin, my eyes wide with terror, searching desperately for any kind of makeshift weapon. My hand closed around the cold, rusted iron of an old fireplace poker I'd noticed earlier, its weight a minuscule comfort in the face of such raw, unseen fury. The pounding continued, each impact a physical blow against my sanity. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. A heavy, suffocating silence descended, broken only by the relentless roar of the wind and rain. It was a silence pregnant with menace, the kind that comes before a predator strikes. I held my breath, straining my ears, every nerve ending screaming. And then a new sound began. Soft, almost playful, yet infinitely more terrifying. A light, rhythmic tapping at one of the windows near the front of the cabin. Tap, tap, tap. The silence that followed the assault on the door had been a cruel trick, a breath before the plunge. That tapping, it was methodical, unhurried, hideously curious. It knew I was in there. And whatever it was patient, terribly, terrifyingly patient. The tapping, delicate yet filled with an unbearable menace, began to move. From one window to the next, it circled the small cabin, a horrifying reconnaissance mission conducted in the heart of the storm. Each tap was like a nail hammered into my coffin of fear. I was a trapped animal, acutely aware of the predator systematically testing the bars of my cage. I huddled in the darkest corner of the main room, the useless poker clutched in my white-knuckled grip, praying for it to stop, for daylight, for a miracle. Then the nature of the sounds from outside shifted. From the back of the cabin, where a small, dilapidated kitchen was located, came a new noise. The distinct, sickening crack of splintering wood. It was followed by a wrenching, tearing sound. A weaker door back there, one I hadn't been able to secure properly, or perhaps a boarded-up window, was being breached. My escape route, if I'd ever truly had one, was gone. I was utterly trapped, the main exit blocked by my terror of whatever still lurked out front, and now an undeniable, forceful entry from the rear. My breath soared in and out of my lungs, in ragged gasps. The sounds of intrusion grew louder, closer, a heavy thud, then footsteps, slow and deliberate, on the kitchen floorboards. A shadow, impossibly tall and thin, fell across the internal doorway leading from the kitchen into the main room where I cowered. A figure, the same gaunt silhouette I'd glimpsed outside, slowly stepped into view, its form starkly silhouetted by a searing flash of lightning that split the sky at that very moment. Its face remained obscured in the fleeting, harsh light and subsequent gloom, but its intent felt utterly, primordially malevolent. In one of its long, spindly hands, it clutched one of those damnable small wooden figures, holding it out slightly as if an offering or a threat. There are moments in life, they say, when your mind just freezes, when terror is so absolute it paralyzes every muscle, every thought. Seeing that thing, that emissary of the storm and the shadows, standing there, that wasn't a moment for freezing. It was a moment to run, or to die right there on the dusty floor of Silas Blackwood's cursed cabin. Pure, primal adrenaline surged through my veins, momentarily eclipsing the paralysis of fear. With a choked scream that was more animal than human, I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy old oil lamp from a side table, and hurled it with all my might towards the shadowy figure in the doorway. It struck with a dull thud, eliciting a strange, guttural grunt from the intruder, buying me a precious second. I didn't wait to see more. I bolted for the main door, the one I'd barricaded. My fingers, clumsy with terror, fumbled with the heavy armchair, scraping it back just enough. I yanked the protesting door open and plunged headlong out into the raging storm, the wind and rain hitting me like a physical blow. Behind me I heard a sound, a kind of enraged, drawn-out hiss, and then the heavy, rapid thud of footsteps giving chase. The forest was a nightmare maze in the storm's fury. Branches like skeletal arms whipped at my face and body, tearing at my clothes. The ground beneath my feet was a treacherous soup of mud and slick leaves, sucking at my shoes, trying to drag me down. I fell, scrambled up, gasping for air, driven by a terror so profound it was a physical force. The rain blinded me, the wind roared in my ears, and every flash of lightning threatened to expose my desperate flight. Once I risked a glance back. A lightning strike illuminated the clearing, and there it was, the gaunt figure, closer than I dared to imagine, moving with a disturbing, almost unnatural agility through the storm-lashed woods. It wasn't human, not entirely. The forest was trying to swallow me whole, and behind me something far worse was gaining. Every instinct screamed that if I stopped, if I faltered for even a moment, Blackwood Creek would claim another victim, and I would become another whispered tale in Oakhaven. I don't know how long I ran, fueled by a terror that burned through my exhaustion. It felt like an eternity, each step a victory, each breath a stolen moment. Then, by some miracle, by sheer dumb luck or a desperate surge of adrenaline-fueled energy, I stumbled out of the dense tree line and onto the rough surface of the main gravel road. I collapsed, sobbing, my body a mess of cuts and bruises, soaked to the bone and shivering uncontrollably. Just as I thought I could go no further, a pair of bright headlights cut through the relentless curtain of rain. A large truck, one of the few that ever used this remote route late at night, was lumbering its way along the road. I waved my arms frantically, screaming incoherently. The truck slowed, then stopped. The driver, a burly man with a kind, bewildered face, helped me into the warm cab. My rescue was a blur of frantic, disjointed explanations. He must have thought I was insane, but he called the authorities as soon as he got a signal. Later, the local sheriff and a deputy investigated the cabin. They found it ransacked, the crude wooden figures scattered around the main room, some of them broken, snapped in two. There was no sign of any intruder, no footprints distinct enough in the storm-ravaged mud to offer any clues. The locals in Oakhaven, when questioned, offered no explanations, just those knowing, silent stares that spoke volumes, yet revealed nothing. The legend of what lurked in Blackwood Forest remained just that, a legend. But it was a legend I now believed with every traumatized fiber of my being. I never went back to Blackwood Creek, of course. The cabin, I heard some years later, finally collapsed under the weight of winter snow and sheer neglect, slowly being reclaimed by the forest that had always owned it. But sometimes, even now, safe in my city apartment, when a particularly violent storm rages outside my window, I see that gaunt silhouette in the flashes of lightning. I hear that soft, scraping sound against the walls, and I know, with a chilling certainty, that some things don't just stay in the woods. Some things, some terrors, they stay with you forever.